Transnational Civil Society in Asia, broadcast today on Zoom and Facebook Live. My name is Melissa Conley-Tyler, and I'm a Research Associate at the Asia Institute at the University of Melbourne. I acknowledge that the Asia Institute is located on the unceded land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I personally am in Taiwan at the moment, and so I recognise Taiwan's Indigenous people. And I'm interested, I've already learned a little bit about the connections between Australia's Indigenous people and Taiwan's Indigenous people, which is a great example of the sort of transnational civil society cooperation that we'll be talking about today. So we're going to start off with a presentation from Professor Akihiro Ogawa, who's a Professor of Japanese Studies at the Asia Institute. He's going to tell you a little bit more about the research cluster on transnational civil society and the book that we'll be launching today. We'll then have three of our chapter authors who are going to tell you more about their fascinating research. So we have Akina Mikami, who's a PhD student at the Asia Institute. We have Dr. Salim-Lakha, who's with the School of Social and Political Sciences, and Dr. Pradeep Taneja, also at the School of Social and Political Sciences here at the University of Melbourne. Now, we know we have a wonderful expert audience who've joined us today, and we're really excited to have you. We want this to be nice and interactive. We want to hear your reactions. So as each of the speakers are speaking, if you have a reaction, a question, even just a thought that comes into your mind, please do share it on the Q&A. And we look forward to having discussion at the end of the presentations and hearing your views, which is just as valuable for our speakers as it is for you to hear theirs. So without any further ado, over to you, Akihiro.
Okay, thank you very much, Melissa. So I'm going to share a slide, PowerPoint. Oh, can you see it? Okay. Okay, thank you very much, Melissa. I'm Akihiro Ogawa, Professor of Japanese Studies here in the Asia Institute. Also, I'm chairing the research cluster on Asian civil society since its establishment. So yeah, I should a little bit talk about our research clusters and also our research civil society, but probably it's better to define our terminology first. I made a simple slide here. So civil society, which stimulate our research and intellectual curiosity, is one of the most dynamically expanding sector in contemporary Asia. And by definition, it is a public sphere that broadly incorporates non-state institutions and associations that are critical to sustain modern democratic participation. This is our working definition. So based on this working definition, we are developing our scholarship. And then Asia. In our research, Asia is another keyword. So originally, it's a product of Western thinking and socio-economic development. Civil society represents a particular set of relationships between the state and either society or the individual. So we will attempt to delineate the distinctive characteristics of Asian civil society. That being said, our intention is not simplify or essentialize the nature of Asian civil society. Instead, we want to consider the diverse representation of forms and patterns framed within civil society. So civil society, in order to address these points, I have been organizing a series of international conferences and workshops. So in February 2017, we had a first conference here in Melbourne. Scholars and the students across the world got together, presented ideas, and discussed the research directions in the future. And then our discussion culminated Routledge Handbook of Civil Society in Asia. So this book has 21 country review and 14 thematic chapters. And I would say it is one of the most comprehensive reference sources in the field. And also I need to mention it's a paperback. And then our colleague, Anthony Spires, Vedi Hardis, Claire Marie, Pradeep Taneja, Salim-Lakha, Nadim Malik, and me. So these are included in this chapter, their chapter authors. So in the conference discussion, we identified 4 issues understudied. or the areas we need to investigate in order to push the scholarship forward. So those are, first, transnational civil society. Second, intersectionality focusing on human rights issues. And third, comparative studies in democracy and authoritarianism. And fourth, civil society and media. And then our collaboration effort started. We have been discussing those issues in the conference, in the workshops to enhance the scholarship on civil society Asia. And I'd like to express our appreciation to Asia Institute, Arts Faculty, Japan Foundation, Toyota Foundation for generous support. And our discussion have culminated in a series of publications, Asian Studies Review special issues on human rights and civil society. Our colleagues, Ken Setiawan and Anthony Spires, are contributing editors. And we made a documentary film, Civil Society and War Reconciliation. This was done by Claudia Starrett and me. And then edited volume, first one, Transnational Civil Society in Asia, and then another edited volume, Authoritarianism in Asia, Civil Society in Asia are coming. So today, I'm very happy to introduce our new research outcome, Transnational Civil Society in Asia, the Potential of Grassroots Regionalization, edited by Simon Avenell and me, which will be published this coming July. And then here is a table of content, as you see. This book has 11 chapters, and among them, 4 chapters, which I have bolded, the chapter titles and authors from Melbourne University scholars. So Transnational Civil Society, this volume, this is a pioneering interdisciplinary effort to analyze civil society in Asia through the lens of inter-Asia connectivities. So in order to obtain a more holistic understanding of this growing border-crossing grassroots regional space. So by transnational, we mean economic, political, and cultural processes that extend beyond the boundaries of nation states. And our book looks at the increasing interactions among civil society actors that transcend national borders and in turn are helping to facilitate the continued strengthening of common democratic values. One point I need to mention here is we know the concept of global civil society. Although the two descriptions, global and transnational, often used interchangeably, but in our book, we use transnational civil society because the phenomena we explore mostly operate at levels below the global, wherein this term transnational is understood to involve groups and individuals from every part of the world. That being said, the idea of global civil society does inform our analysis. So global civil society not only describes certain kinds of institutions and groups operating in every part of the world, it also represents a space for the diffusion of global ideas and global norms, such as human rights, ethnic and gender equality, and environmentalism. Hence, to the extent that they imbue and practice such norms, lower levels of civil society, for example, Asian nations and Asian regions, become part of the global phenomenon. And also this book investigates the emergence of transnational civil society in Asia through the lens of grassroots regionalization, evident in a border crossing initiative from the earliest years after World War II, intensifying in the civic and student activism of the 1960s and 70s, and flourishing with the explosion of NGOs in Asia and worldwide from 1980s onward. And nation states and corporations continue to dominate international interaction in Asia, but the growing transnational civil society groups involved in humanitarianism, gender, historical reconciliation, environmental protection, human rights, minority empowerment, migration, and development speaks to historical process of grassroots regionalization in Asia, which, while not always visible, has played an important role in shaping regional identity, particularly at the grassroots. So this process of grassroots regionalization echoes with earlier histories of Pan-Asianism in the early 20th century, but however, differed fundamentally in its new agendas informed by global projects of post-World War II era, such as human rights and environmentalism. So this book has a examined the 4 manifestations of transnational civil society in Asia. First, local transformation and connections. One of the speakers today, Akina Mikami's chapter, is included in this category. So the chapters here reveals the ways in which local identities and struggles throughout Asia have been and are being empowered by transnational interconnections and initiatives. And second, diaspora politics, a chapter by Pradeep Taneja and Sujit Danji is in this category. They conceptualize and explore the role of civil society organizations that coordinated their efforts at local, national, and global levels to meet the needs of stranded Indians and other South Asians during the COVID-19 pandemic. It aims to capture their initiative and the social capital that transcend borders to bridge the gap in delivering services to at-risk people. And third, cross-regional initiatives and networks. Salim-Lakha's chapter in this category. So Salim focuses on the developmental initiatives of one of the Aga Khan Development Network's agencies, namely the Aga Khan Rural Support Program, or AKRSP, which has been active in the remote mountainous regions of northern Pakistan. So Salim examined how pluralism is promoted through the activities of AKRSP in a region characterized by ethnic diversity and some of the challenges that the agencies faces. And fourth, global actors and influences. This examines the interplay between global actors and the influences and transnational civil society in Asia. However, today, we don't have the chapter from this manifestation. So, however, today we have 3 wonderful chapter authors. So first speaker in Akina Mikami, one of my PhD students. And also, if you have any comments or question, reflection, whatever, please use the Q&A section. Okay, here is Akina.
Thank you, Professor Ogawa. Thank you for having me here today. I'd like to firstly express my special thanks to Professor Akihiro Ogawa and co-editor Professor Simon Avenell for inviting me to contribute. As a PhD student, I do feel very honored and humbled to participate in these discussions alongside very prominent and established scholars in this field, including Dr. Kassim-Lakha and Dr. Pradeep Taneja here today. And it is my pleasure to introduce one of the book chapters. I'm just starting the slide. Introducing one of the book chapters, which looks at civil society practice between Fukushima in Japan and Cairns in Australia in context of disaster recovery following the triple disaster of earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear accident in March 11th, 2011, or what has come to be called 3/11. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wotjobaluk peoples, traditional custodians of the land from where I meet today in Horsham, Victoria, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I'd also like to remember those whose lives were lost in the 3/11 disaster and honour the communities who continue to live through the lasting impacts of the disaster. The transnational civil society practice that is featured in this book chapter is a practice called recuperation. This is something that civil society groups in Japan, and actually at one point in more than 20 countries, have been running after the nuclear accident in Fukushima. It began with the aim of providing opportunities for children living in Fukushima to spend weekends and holidays in a place away from risks of additional radiation exposure. doing outdoor activities, such as going into the sea, camping in the mountains. Recuperation programs started originally in Ukraine and Belarus for people affected by the Chernobyl nuclear accident in 1986. And after 3/11, civil society groups in Japan have started to trial similar activities. What is striking about this is that despite significant progress in reconstruction and considering that issues of radiation risks have become much less prevalent today, there has been ongoing demand from the affected communities for these activities. This chapter studies recuperation practice as more than a place of refreshment. It approaches it as a transnational grassroots civil society practice that challenges the idea of what it means to recover resiliently from a disaster. The question that is addressed in this chapter is, how does civil society shape the notion of disaster resilience? And examines this question through a case study of a recuperation practice that has been taking place in Cairns in Australia, which I conducted from 2017 to this year as part of my PhD project. And drawing on this case study, the chapter discusses this in context of the idea of disaster resilience as a contested notion, critiquing specifically the neoliberal forms of resilience that I argue has been enacted in state-led reconstruction process, and seeking the potential of transnational grassroots civil society practice to articulate alternative forms of resilience, alternative ways of recovering from disaster, what can be called grassroots resilience. Just briefly, disaster resilience, when coupled with neoliberal vision, focuses on primacy of the market and discourse of self-responsibility in informing how societies cope, adapt, and rebuild from disasters. Neoliberal resilience pursues political and economic gains as the overriding priority in restoring systems and communities in disaster recovery, even sometimes at the expense of neglecting pressing social and environmental needs. Grassroots resilience resists neoliberal subjectivity and imagines alternative resilient futures. The chapter characterizes the Fukushima Cairns recuperation practice as translocal care that simultaneously exposes the unmet needs in state-led reconstruction process. And it does so by highlighting three features. Firstly, this practice reconnects bodies to an environment that is free from concerns of radioactive contamination. In Cairns, children experience activities such as snorkeling in the Great Barrier Reef, or walking in rainforests, or staying overnight in farms, and so forth. And what is being claimed in these activities is the capability of bodies to engage playfully with the natural world, the fulfillment of such basic needs, and the need for restoration of Fukushima's ecological environment. At the same time, it also reveals the ongoing problems that Fukushima faces. For example, although beaches in Fukushima have been opened now for recreation, high level of radiation can still be detected from sand in some areas. And the government has also announced recently that treated radioactive water will be released into the ocean due to lack of storage space, a decision that the government has described as inevitable for reconstruction. Secondly, this practice creates safe space for participants to voice concerns that they have. Opportunities are created for children and their families to give an account of 3/11 disaster from their point of view. During the refreshment camps, children make English speeches to communities in Cairns about the experiences of the disaster and their hopes for the future. In annual fundraiser events, participants send photos and newspaper clippings and images that communicate details about situations in Fukushima from their everyday perspective. And this act of valuing voice exposes the politics of voice in disaster recovery. After the nuclear accident, raising concerns about radiation risks has become a social taboo because it has been associated with opposing reconstruction efforts and contributing to spread of harmful rumors about Fukushima. More recently, there is also a problem of collective forgetting as memories of disaster fades from public memory. Thirdly, this practice explores alternative environmental futures. Participants explore the possibility of a future that does not rely on nuclear energy, for example. Examples include study sessions with a local wind farm or a visit to a home of a local retired engineer who lives off the grid, so to speak, generating energy solely from solar and batteries. More as a means to open up conversations about what might be possible. Participants also learned to their great surprise that the Australian Aboriginal clan, the Mira tribe, is still to this day grieving for the people of Fukushima because the uranium that has been mined from their lands has been used in a nuclear power plant against their will. And that was actually confirmed that it was used in the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant that exploded in the 3/11 disaster. Children learned that the emotional burdens of nuclear disaster were not only shared by people of Fukushima, but also by the Aboriginal people in Australia, bringing a transnational outlook on socio-ecological interdependence. And these explorations contrast with the Japanese government's strategic long-term energy plan, which positions nuclear energy as an economically viable and low-carbon energy option. Currently, 9 reactors have restarted with a view to have 30 reactors operating by 2030. And meanwhile, the decommissioning of the damaged nuclear power plant continues to face problems, and evacuation measures in other stations have not been sufficiently developed. So to sum up, the chapter analyzes the recuperation practice as an expression of counter-neoliberal disaster resilience. It explores the possibility of a transnational grassroots civil society practice to imagine a resilient future that leads a different trajectory to state-led reconstruction process. I think that this chapter will be of interest to those who are interested in not only Japanese civil society and 3/11 disaster, but also the role of civil society in disaster recovery politics more broadly, which is significant considering that Asia is one of the most disaster-prone regions of the world, and hence debates on disaster resilience needs to have more attention, I suppose. Thank you for listening. That's all from me. Please do provide comments and questions in the Q&A section. And I will now hand over to our next speaker, Dr. Salim-Lakha. Thank you.
Thank you, Akina, for your introduction. I would like to thank Professor Ogawa and Professor Avenell and Melissa Conley-Tyler for inviting me to this session. And I look forward to presenting my slides. Now, I will take you to one of the highest points in the world, which is in northern Pakistan. And we will look at the work of the Aga Khan Rural Support Program, which has operated in that region since 1982. The Aga Khan Rural Support Program is an agency of the Aga Khan Development Network, which operates in 30 countries. The head of the Aga Khan Development Network is Prince Karim Aga Khan IV, who is the spiritual leader of Shia Ismaili Muslims. And the work of AKDN is inspired by the ethics of Islam. Now, even though it is inspired by the ethics of Islam, its projects cater for people of all faiths, ethnicities, and nationalities. And the key ethical principle guiding the work of AKDN is pluralism, which is defined as respect for diversity and promotion of inclusiveness. So my presentation will look at the work of Aga Khan Rural Support Program, which involves promoting community development projects in northern Pakistan, and I asked the question, how effective has AKRSP been in promoting community-based development projects, and how effective it has been in promoting inclusiveness in the region. Now, the region that I'm looking at is the district of Chitral, which borders Afghanistan, as you can see on this map, and the province of Gilgit-Baltistan, which borders China and India. And I should mention that Gilgit that is disputed by India and Pakistan. So its status has not been completely resolved. And because of its uncertain status, it has received somewhat less attention and resources from the central government in Pakistan. This is also a challenging environment to be working in for AKRSP for a number of reasons. It's highly mountainous. The K2 mountain, the second highest peak in the world, is located in Gilgit-Baltistan, and it straddles Gilgit-Baltistan in China. The other important factor is that the communities here are in very remote locations. They are dispersed. On top of that, you find that this area was isolated for a long time from the main centers of economic activity in Pakistan and the main center of governance in Pakistan, because the communication and transport was not sufficiently developed. It was only with the opening of the Karakoram Highway in mid-1980s that this area was properly connected to other parts of Pakistan. And finally, what makes this area very challenging is that it is subject, particularly in recent years, to tensions and violence between different sectarian groups, in particularly the Sunni Muslims on the one hand and the Shia Muslims on the other hand. Now, if we look at these statistics on sectarian distribution of population, what we find is the Ismaili Muslims are a minority in both the areas. And the Sunni Muslims are in the majority in the district of Chitral. And Gilgit-Baltistan, you find that the Shia Isnashri Muslims are in the majority. And one of the problems here is that the AKDN and the Aga Khan Rural Support Program, or AKRSP, are seen organizations that represent the Ismaili Muslims, and that they are associated with the Ismaili Muslims, which leads to a rather tricky situation. And when we look at the map of Gilgit-Baltistan, what we find is that sectarian distinctions are also evident in their geographical distribution. So for example, in the Gizer district, you have mainly Ismaili population. In Astor and in Daimer, you have Sunni Muslims. In Skadu, you have the Shia Isnashri Muslims. And in Ganchi, you have a Sufi sect. And this mix does not always create tensions, but with the rise of religious extremist groups in Pakistan, it has led to violence from time to time. So I don't want to give the impression that they are always living in tension. However, one thing needs to be noted, which is that by many accounts, the Sunni Muslims of Astor, and particularly Daimer, have kept aloof from the work of the Aga Khan Rural Support Program. So what are the main developmental aims of the Aga Khan Rural Support Program? The main aims are to build small infrastructure projects, to provide access to markets, and to generate income-raising opportunities through various means. And these aims have been pursued by a strategy of setting up village organizations and women's organizations. Now, the village organizations are mainly male organizations, and they require 75% of the population to agree to form a village organization. The aim behind village organizations is to make developmental activity participatory, democratic, and to promote inclusion. The main objective of the village organization initially was to construct what is referred to as productive physical infrastructure. And this includes irrigation canals, it includes construction of roads, but also construction of micro hydroelectricity power stations, locally referred to as hydels. And these have been very popular both in Chitral and in Gilgit-Baltistan. They have transformed the lives and livelihoods of the local population. The women's organizations were set up as separate groups to provide a forum where women can express their needs. And these have been involved in construction of smaller scale infrastructure projects, social projects, like, for example, promoting adult literacy and training of traditional birth attendants, and also income generating activities like tailoring, cultivation of fruits, vegetables, and other crops. So what has the AKRSP achieved in the time that it has been operating in northern Pakistan since 1982? And one of the striking outcomes is that between 1991 and 2001, poverty declined in those areas from 67% to 34%, and per capita incomes rose from 1/3 to 2/3 of the national income. Now, this is an impressive outcome. About 2,300 village organizations were established and 1,400 women's organizations were set up within 2 decades. I should also mention here that not all of the credit can be attributed to AKRSP's work. It's important to recognize that there was also some government input. Other NGOs have been active in the region. The Karakoram Highway was very important in raising the level of economic activity in the region. So once one gives credit to these other factors, what has to be emphasized, though, is that AKRSP has been a very important player in this particular region. And the example of AKRSP has been followed in other provinces in Pakistan. So rural support programs have been set up in other provinces, and there are, I think, currently 12 rural support programs in Pakistan. And some of the training and the implementation of these other rural support programs was provided by the staff of AKRSP. They have played a very important role, not just in supporting these rural support programs, but some of their staff have gone on to form their own NGOs. They've gone to work with government and other organizations. So they have taken the AKRSP's practices and example and disseminated that experience widely. The example of AKRSP has also been followed in parts of Afghanistan and Tajikistan, where the Aga Khan Development Network, AKDN, has been quite active. And the AKDN has played an important role in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, in Tajikistan, also in the provision of health services, in the provision of education services, in the rehabilitation of monuments and other activities. So the work of AKRSP has been reinforced by various agencies of the Aga Khan Development Network. Now, just to finish off then, how successful has AKRSP, AKDN been in promoting pluralism, inclusiveness? And what one finds is that the acceptance of the projects promoted by AKRSP has not been uniform. The Ismailis, who are the followers of the Aga Khan, have been the most enthusiastic people who have taken to these projects, and consequently they have progressed further in social and economic terms compared to other communities. Nevertheless, by the year 2000, 85% of the rural households in Chitral and Gilgit-Baltistan were covered by community organizations that were promoted by AKRSP. And when one looks at the distribution of resources in comparison to the proportion of population, we find that the non-Ismaili population in Chitral and Gilgit-Baltistan represents 73% of the total, but they accounted for 67% of the village and women's organizations that were formed. They accounted for 63% of the funds for infrastructure projects and 50% of the credit that was distributed. So what one does find is that the non-Ismailis have benefited, but perhaps they could have benefited more if their participation had been of a greater extent. And just to conclude then, what I have to point out here is that in talking about pluralism, one needs to take into account the fact that pluralism, as the Aga Khan has mentioned, is a process. It's not a product. It requires a lot of hard work. It requires dialogue. It requires understanding between different communities. And the other point that I want to emphasize is that inclusion, pluralism requires also effort by the state, because the state is the only entity which has the resources and the capacity to disseminate pluralist values in a systematic fashion. And if the state is not fully committed to these values and to this effort, then I don't think that NGOs by themselves can do the job of the state. They can provide inspiration, they can provide an example, but the state has to step in. And I think I'll finish off there. I would welcome your questions and comments, of course. Thank you very much. And I would like to now welcome Dr. Pradeep Taneja, who is our next speaker. But Pradeep, to you.
Thank you, Salim. And thank you, Akihiro, for inviting me to contribute the chapter to this book, along with my co-author, Surjit Dhanji. Dr. Dhanji is, I noticed, in the audience, so I give her a big wave. And Surjit Dhanji and I started working on this chapter after COVID broke out in February, March last year. And of course, when initially we started looking at COVID and how it was affecting countries like India, we had no idea how serious the situation was going to be. We thought 2020 was bad, but 2021 is proving to be much worse for India. So, I have the people of India in my thoughts as I give this talk, and hopefully the situation would be brought under control soon. But by all indications, it looks like the virus hasn't peaked in India yet. All Indian virologists are saying that the situation will probably last a bit longer. But the focus of our chapter in this book is in fact not on India, but on the Indian diaspora and Indian citizens who are outside India, or who were outside at the time that this pandemic began. So we're looking at the role of transnational civil society groups in helping Indians who were stranded by the COVID-19 pandemic. And let me just begin by giving you an outline of what we're doing in this chapter. The focus of this chapter is on the role of the Indian diaspora, or to be precise, the transnational civil society organizations run by the Indian diaspora in delivering essential services to those Indians who were stranded by the pandemic. I mean, pandemic itself, of course, didn't strand people, but it was the policies adopted by various governments, including lockdowns, which led to the people being stranded. The geographies we're covering in this chapter are Australia, United Kingdom, and the Middle East. And so what we've done in writing this chapter, that we, since Indian diaspora is quite extensive, and in our next slide, we'll give you some data on that. But since the Indian diaspora is very widespread, we thought we'll focus on a limited number of jurisdictions or geographies. So we looked at Australia, United Kingdom, and the Middle East. And we are focusing on 3 separate organizations. And these organizations are Khalsa Aid, which is based in the UK, the Indian social clubs in Dubai and Oman, and the Hindu Council of Australia. So as you can see from their names, 2 of these organizations are faith-based or religion-based. One, Khalsa Aid, of course, is a Sikh faith-based organization. Hindu Council of Australia, as the name implies, is a Hindu faith-based organization, whereas the social clubs in Dubai and Oman are more secular organizations. But all 3 of these organizations played a significant role in assisting the members of Indian communities in different locations, particularly in the 3 locations that we are looking at here: Australia, United Kingdom, and the Middle East. Khalsa Aid, of course, is a UK-based organization, but we are focusing here in their work, particularly in Australia. And what comes out of the examination of these 3 case studies is the message that social capital amongst the diaspora networks is very important. And in the last slide, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the idea of social capital. Of course, I think given that our audience consists of very accomplished people and social scientists, I can see the names of people who are attending this seminar. And therefore, I don't think we need to go into too much the idea of social capital, except to say that the idea of social capital was popularized by Robert Putnam through his research. Now, in terms of when we use the term stranded people, we are referring to people who have been unable to move from somewhere or to return home. So this is the general definition of being stranded, that when people are unable to move from where they are or to go home. Indian diaspora, of course, is one of the largest diasporas in the world. There's 13 million Indian citizens, the people who are still Indian citizens, but live overseas or work overseas, and 17 million people of Indian origin who are spread across 146 countries in practically all continents. And when we talk about stranded people, we are not really talking about stranded migrants. Our focus here is not stranded migrants. So in the literature on migrants, there is there's description of multiple reasons why people become, or migrants become, stranded. Our focus here is not on the migrants, but on people who are essentially short-term visitors to other countries for tourism, business, education, work, or family reasons. And they're stranded because they cannot return home due to the decisions of various governments which have imposed travel restrictions, or because airlines have canceled their services. So airline or even railways have canceled their transportation services. Lockdowns, of course, are tough on citizens in locations where lockdowns have been imposed, but they're even tougher for people who are stranded there. So at least, for example, when Victoria went through its lockdowns, and many of us were affected by the lockdowns in Victoria, but you can imagine the plight of people who did not have proper accommodation, who were keen to go back and join their families, and who had, in many cases, no source of income. So lockdowns can be very harsh measures, in an effort to contain the pandemic. And if you look at foreign students or temporary visa holders, they were denied assistance by the host governments in the countries or the locations that we've studied for this chapter. In Australia, for example, in April last year, in April 2020, Prime Minister Scott Morrison, when he announced JobKeeper and other packages of assistance for Australian people, he told the international students that if they can't support themselves, they can go home. Of course, not sort of taking into consideration, although I'm sure Scott Morrison was very well aware that many of them could not go back. Going back was not an option, and that's why they are stranded. And among all the other problems that stranded individuals were facing, these problems were compounded by the fact that they had lost their income. In many cases, many of the students, for example, were working in the service sector, and they lost their jobs because service sector jobs were the first ones to go. And therefore, they were unable to pay rent or pay bills or buy food even. And therefore, they had to turn to the Indian diaspora. So obviously, those who were living in Australia or in the Middle East, they turned to the Indian diaspora in those communities. And you can imagine the psychological impact of feeling stranded. So apart from all the practical problems they faced in terms of paying bills or not having enough money to buy food, there's also a tremendous psychological impact of feeling stranded. And that contributes to this uncertainty and anxiety from being separated from their families. In many cases, there were people who had traveled here without their children. There were grandparents who had come to Australia to be with their children and grandchildren who became stranded. So there's a whole variety of people who became stranded, and they were not Australian, they were not migrants in Australia. They had no permanent base or permanent source of income in Australia. So these stranded people turned to the Indian diaspora. And what we did in this chapter, as I said at the beginning, we looked at three case studies, three separate organizations. And one of these organizations, of course, was the Khalsa Aid. As I said, Khalsa Aid is a United Kingdom-based humanitarian charity, which operates across Europe, Africa, Asia, Australia. It does some, great work in many locations. It's founded on Sikh principles. The Sikhs, as I think many of you would be aware, are amongst the most active communities when it comes to community service. It's very much part of the Sikh religion. And this Sikh principle of Sarva da Bhala, meaning well-being for all, is what motivates the Sikh community in offering service to the community. And it's not only limited to donations. In fact, Sikh communities across the world go beyond simply donating money. In fact, it's actually their, personal contribution, the voluntary contribution of their labor is particularly important, part of the service provided by the Sikh community. And often, the Khalsa Aid organization is among the first to arrive in any disaster zone, whether it's in Africa or in Asia or in Europe. And in fact, they operate in both Australia and New Zealand. So even, down under, they're very active in providing services in times of need. So in Australia, during the COVID-19 pandemic in Australia, I mean, I'm not suggesting that the pandemic is over, but particularly last year when we had severe lockdowns in multiple states in Australia, the Khalsa Aid provided dry groceries under their COVID-19 grocery aid program. They collected funds, they collected groceries. People who were donating money or groceries, they were directly, in fact, placing orders to supermarkets and other Indian groceries, for example, where their volunteers would go and collect the groceries directly from the supermarkets and shops, take them to sorting centers, and then distribute them to people who needed them. In terms of identifying who needed help, they relied on social media, and social media played a very important part, in fact, in all three organizations that we have done case studies of. So since the time is very limited, I'm going to turn to the next case study we looked at was Indian social clubs in Dubai and Oman. I think as many of you would be aware that Gulf Cooperation Council countries or in the Middle East are home to more than 23 million foreign workers. And a large proportion of those are Indian workers, all from the Indian subcontinent. Nearly 3.4 million Indians live and work in the United Arab Emirates alone. Then you have, countries like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait also have sizable Indian or South Asian populations. And these economies were very badly affected because they are largely hydrocarbon dependent economies. They mainly depend on oil income. And because of COVID-19, the demand for oil collapsed. And as a result, the price of oil also collapsed. So tax revenues of governments fell very sharply in these countries. And many of the businesses had to shut down. And therefore, many of these workers became unemployed. So they had no families there in many cases, no other support systems. And they also turned to the Indian diaspora in these countries. And the diaspora, of course, consists of people who have been settled there for a long time. So contrary to the temporary workers, many members of the Indian diaspora have been there for a long time and are very well established. The government of the United Arab Emirates offered some help, including free healthcare to stranded workers. But the Indian diplomatic missions, the Indian consulates and embassies were overwhelmed by the demand from the Indian workers for repatriation and financial help. The social clubs in Dubai and Oman, they played an important part. They've been there, of course, for a long time. Some of these clubs were established in the 1950s. So they raised money to pay for airfares. Hundreds of workers received plane tickets bought for by the Indian social clubs in Dubai and Oman. And they also helped desperate Indians who were stranded there to negotiate with government agencies, with the local UAE agencies. Remember that in many cases, these workers lack linguistic skills. In many cases, they are in fact not even literate. And therefore, in negotiating with the UAE government agencies, the clubs also played a very important part. And I think also importantly, they provided education to these Indian workers in Oman in particular on health and hygiene, in addition to, of course, providing food and other essentials. So they had a campaign of educating these workers because many of these workers were living in very crowded conditions in dormitories or in crowded apartments around these cities. Finally, the third organization we looked at was the Hindu Council of Australia and their work in Australia, in both Victoria and New South Wales. And as I said, it's a faith-based organization which operates in all the states and territories in Australia. The HCA also liaised with the Australian government on matters pertaining to the welfare of Indian diaspora in Australia, and therefore they already had well-established links with Australian government agencies at all levels, local, state, and federal. And they were able to assist the members of the Indian community who were stranded in various states in Australia. HCA also became a hub of support for stranded Indians, and they had their own COVID-19 humanitarian project. So they provided food aid. So for example, they had these the so-called karma kitchens, which provided free food and particularly vegetarian food to many Indians who are vegetarian in Parramatta, in New South Wales, and in fact also in Victoria. Their volunteers prepared care kits. Care kits consisted of groceries, mainly dry groceries, which could last up to from 2 to 3 weeks. So those people who had lost income or students who were stranded, who could not get money from home because their parents were also affected by COVID in India. And therefore, HCA provided food aid to them in the form of cooked food and also care kits. Okay, so just finally, I know that you're keen to get to the Q&A and time is short. Just finally, in conclusion, these case studies have demonstrated how different diaspora organizations have transcended borders and barriers during lockdown restrictions to reach out to fellow human beings, fellow compatriots, fellow Indians, and others, in fact, not just Indians, many other South Asians who were also stranded in Australia received support from these organizations. And these NGOs also became necessary conduits and lifelines, in fact, for essential support to stranded Indians during the pandemic. They leveraged their social capital, being strong bonds of solidarity and common values that bridge ties spanning different communities and governments. And they provided, they leveraged their social capital for the benefit of the stranded Indians. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pradeep. And this has been a phenomenal discussion. We've gone from the top of the Himalayas to the Cairns rainforest to look at the whole range of different transnational civil society cooperation. Now, in terms of timing and questions, we've had one comment, and thank you very much, Jane Munro, who responded to Pradeep's discussion of the work of different faith groups in their situation, both of the stranded international students and also, for example, in the bushfires. And I think it's a fascinating area to look at, very topical right at the moment. We know that in the case of stranded students, not enough was done at the government level. Obviously, for example, the City of Melbourne did some work, individual universities have, but at the national level, there was a big gap, and civil society was what stood up and tried to assist. Now, I'm conscious we're right on time, so I suppose if there's any sort of questions or things that we haven't covered, I have a simple solution. Everyone on the line should go out and buy the book. If you're not getting an author copy, which you might be in some cases, you should definitely go and buy it and read more. What I think today's shown for me very clearly is the breadth of research that the Asia Institute helps stimulate and curate, and the sort of products that come out of it. What's come out in this book, and you've only had a taster here today with a few of the chapters, is just how much fascinating work is happening across the region, and what we can do as as part of Australia's Asia experts to try to show that and understand it and theorise it and share it. So I'm excited that today we've been able to document some of this work. We've been able to hear the voices of the people who've been doing this wonderful research. That recording is now going to be available on the Melbourne Asia Review site. So that's the one of the publications at the Asia Institute. And then I'll continue to share the work that we're doing and our researchers are doing at the University of Melbourne with a wider audience. So I'd like to, again, thank all of the authors, thank our publishers, and particularly thank our presenters today. So thank you very much to Akihiro, to Akina, to Salim, and to Pradeep, and look forward to hearing you and seeing you again at one of the Asia Institute webinars in the future. Thank you again.
Thank you.